Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the conversation series. I am very excited today because I have a fellow podcaster here with me. I have Javier Leiva here with me, host of two different podcasts, Pretend and then Criminal Conduct. And I am very excited to have him here with me, and I'm going to turn it over to him and let him introduce himself.
Danielle, thank you so much for inviting me. So, like you said, my name is Javier Leiva, and I host two podcasts.
Yeah.
The first one was Pretend. It's a show about con artists and people pretending to be someone else. So I actually go after these con artists and
Yeah.
try to interview them, which is nuts. And then my second podcast is called Criminal Conduct, where we take one case per season, very much like Serial. My co-host is a former Secret Service agent, and he's a private investigator, and he has
Oh,
some
yeah.
super duper secret government clearance that I have no idea what he actually does. But
Yeah.
it's an interesting podcast, and we're working on season 4 right now. I'm flying to St. Louis next week.
I want to start from the beginning with you because I met you, this past summer, and it was so interesting to hear what you've created with Pretend. How did Pretend come to be?
When I started Pretend, podcasting was still a hobby for most people. Like it wasn't even fathomable that this could be like a full-time gig, which is not, it's not my full-time gig. But people make a living off of podcasting. It really is. But back then, it was just something that I wanted to do to help me pass the time and have like a creative outlet.
Yeah.
And the show started off as a very not about con artists. It was about people pretending to be someone else, but like ghostwriters and stand-up comedians who had to like assume a character in order to accomplish their performance. Right? It
Yeah.
was like a very artsy fartsy show. And then I talked to my my con artist cousin who had just been released, or I don't know, he was in the process of going into federal prison. And so I knew that he was, the black sheep of the family, but I never knew exactly why he was going to prison. And so he sat down and we recorded it and he told me everything and my jaw dropped. And that's when I realized, okay, this show is
Yeah.
about con artists, way more interesting than ghostwriters and
Yeah.
stand-up comedians.
Is that where your fascination came from for con artists? Like, where does
You know,
that fascination?
I actually don't have a fascination for con artists. I kind of fell into it. I don't
Yeah.
even like true crime. But I kind of fell into the true crime space, and so like all my podcasts are true crime, and con artists do fascinate me. I don't think I came into it thinking I'm fascinated with con artists, so let me dissect them. No, it was really more like, oh, I stumbled onto this world
Right.
and you meet one con artist and then you meet another one that does like a snake oil salesman, or I interviewed a cult leader, and then I interviewed the king con artist of them all, Frank Abagnale. And then you start getting these patterns start emerging that these people are using the same tactics. It doesn't matter if they're selling you a miracle drug or selling you salvation.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
all the same.
Now, I met you when you were doing all of your stuff with Frank Abagnale. How do you kind of figure out, okay, this is the next con artist I'm going to look at? Like, how does that kind of formulate in your mind?
Well, when you become a con artist connoisseur like I am, you start to realize that, you should probably go after some of the heavy hitters, right? And
Yeah.
Frank Abagnale, I mean, he is the con artist of all cons,
Yeah.
right? Like he's the original George Santos. Because what I realized was that he is not this brilliant con artist.
Yeah.
He actually made up the entire thing. Like he
Yeah.
didn't do any of the cons he's famous for. And so it's like a con within a con. So
Yeah.
when he turned me down initially when I first started the podcast, I actually bought into his lies. I thought that his cons were real. And
Right.
then when he rejected me, I started looking into it and I found this guy named Alan Logan who did this expose on him.
Right.
I teamed up with Alan Logan and realized that none of it was real. I mean, I have his prison record right here. I keep it by my desk. It just shows that I have it upside down, but it just proves that he was in prison the entire time. He was supposedly a doctor, a lawyer, pilot, professor, God
Yeah.
knows what else he claims.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How far do you get? Like, I love to do research. Whenever I have a guest come on, research is one of my favorite things. And I have so many different places I go. How
Mhm.
deep do you get into research?
Oh, deep and not deep enough, right? So, like, deeper than most people. Okay, so this is another thing I keep on my desk. I'm just showing you things I keep at my desk now.
Yeah.
So this is my friend's book is OSINT techniques. So it's a book that shows you how to find publicly available information that's on the web, and I'm talking about like
That's
breach databases, phone numbers,
yeah.
social security number. I could find out all kinds of things about you that is already littered all over the
Right.
web.
Right.
Metadata and photos. You'd be surprised how much information you could get from it. Like, when was that photo taken?
Right.
Oh, that's a big piece of information. Or where is this IP address originating from?
Right.
Like, this is all information that I'm looking for when I'm investigating a case.
Interesting. Like, I could just imagine the things you could probably uncover and just what you could find.
I'm not even that good at it. So I rely on friends in the OSINT community, the open source intelligence
Yeah.
community, to help me out. So, like, I have a stalker case right now that's fascinating. If you haven't listened to it, it's if you thought the Abagnale stuff was interesting, this stuff is really
Yeah.
fascinating. And I had a white hat ethical hacker who's really into this kind of stuff
Yeah.
help me dig up information about all the characters in this story, trying to figure out who this stalker could be. And we learned information that that this person, one of the suspects, has five active devices that she had not disclosed to anybody. Could that be the stalker? Like, so we're using available data to to come up with new evidence.
Yeah.
And this evidence that I come up with, I turn it over to law enforcement when I think it's
Wow.
necessary.
Yeah.
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 Mhm.
Now, how do you like when you're working these and you're actually getting to talk to con artists? How do you convince some of these con artists to get to actually have conversations with you and actually
Yeah.
like get into it?
Yeah, that should be the Achilles heel of this podcast, right? So I approach somebody and they type in Javier and then pretend, oh wait, this podcast is about con artists.
Yeah.
I'm not a con artist. Why would I talk to this guy? So you would think that that would
Yeah.
be the end of my podcast there, but actually, con artists, not all of them, like some of them don't want to talk to me. One of them told me to take a long walk off a short pier,
Yeah.
but a lot of them want to clear their name or get their side of the story out there. And a lot of them take a lot of pride in the work that they do. But I think that the reason why I'm successful in talking with con artists, and even I've even had an interview with a serial killer that lasted, like, I would talk to the serial killer from his jail cell for days, like
Oh,
weeks at a time.
yeah.
And you're like, why would these people talk to you? And it's because I think that I'm talking to them at a respectful level.
Yeah.
I'm not dismissing what they've done, but I'm not judging them, and I give them an opportunity to talk. And I think that there's a lot of value in hearing them out because you get to learn about the way they think, what
Yep.
motivates them,
Yep.
so there's a lot of knowledge that you could derive from a lot of the interviews that I do.
Very interesting. I think it's so fascinating when you get to hop into people's minds like this because you're just like, what is making you tick? Like, what is
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
that is getting you going right now?
Right. Right.
And so I find it so fast. I'm not a true crime person either, but when I get to hear stuff like this, I'm like, how is this possible?
Well, and that's the key because I'm not a true crime person, and
Yeah.
so my podcasts aren't bloody and gory,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's what I don't like about true crime. But the psychology
Yeah.
and the motivations behind it, I could get behind that. I'm all about that, and that's, I mean, even my season with the serial killer, there's very little graphic content in there.
Right. Well, and I think that's what's so fascinating about con artists too. You truly like it is very a psychological thing that you're just diving deep into. And some are similar in some ways and some are very different. Like some
Right.
have that past, whether it be childhood trauma or whatever it may be. It's very interesting to see what like leads people down a
Hmm.
certain pathway to get to what they're doing.
For sure.
Is there any part of this when you're recording these episodes, like how are people getting away with these things, or like are people actually believing these things when they're happening?
I think that I'm not actually. I have the opposite reaction. I go with it with the approach of thinking that anyone could be a victim of a
Okay.
stock of a con artist. Anybody, including myself and you. And if you think that you're not, you're probably more susceptible, right?
Yep.
So that's not the approach that I take. But I think that it is interesting to see those patterns that you were talking about and go with that approach that, hey, you're going to learn something from these guys. You're going to learn why people write to me and they're like, oh, these victims are so stupid for falling for this. And I'm like, yeah, but you don't know until you've been in their shoes. For example, I was just I don't know if you've seen the new Netflix documentary called Don't Pick Up the Phone.
I have.
Well, that was based off of podcast series that I did about prank calls. They were, the caller was pretending to be a cop and instructing managers to strip search their employees. And some of them went as far as sexually violating their employees. So, that's the thing that people are like, I would never fall for that prank. Like, I would never strip search an employee. And I think you're probably right. You probably wouldn't go as far as sexually violating that employee, but I bet you would take that employee into the back room. I bet you would search her, and at some point, common sense will kick in.
Yeah.
But you can't judge somebody that if you have not been tangled in that web,
Yeah.
because these pranks the last for hours, days sometimes, and or cons. I call them pranks. It's just these situations could last a long time. And what con artists do is that they short circuit your reasoning. They create a sense of urgency so that your better judgment doesn't kick in because you're now just in this flight or flight syndrome,
Yeah.
where you're like, and so you make stupid decisions when you're in that position, and they know how to get you there.
Yeah, it's so funny because even when we see videos of, I think it's the popular thing the last 2 years of scam callers calling to try to get whatever they can out of you to do whatever you can, and they do the fear of, oh, we have your information and this has been yada yada yada, and we've seen a lot of that I think in the last few years too. And so people are just acting, and because of that fight or flight situation, like, oh my God, all my information's out there.
Yeah. Hmm.
What am I gonna do? Like, I have no choice but to listen to these people who are,
Right.
they can help me.
Yep.
And
Yep.
it's just nuts. I'm like,
That's how it happens.
flipping on the other side of criminal conduct, you introduced it in the beginning. Your fantastic partner of John Taylor. How
Mhm.
did this one come to be on the working with him, um, and investigating very specific cases?
Well, John has been podcasting way before I even thought about podcasting. He has a podcast called Twisted, and we met at a local podcast meetup. Like you and I met,
Yes.
and he and I were the only true crime podcasters at that meetup, and we're like, we need to work together one day, and we're like, let's come up with something, and this is what we came up with. And criminal conduct it's been great because he is the polar opposite of me. He's very analytical. Even the way he interviews people, he comes from a law enforcement background. So
Yeah.
when he interviews somebody, it feels like an interrogation. It's like he makes you sweat. And with me, I'm like a little bit more disarming, and I
Yeah.
take a little, I go around you a little
Yeah.
bit, circle you, kind of disarm you, make you feel like you're not being interviewed.
Yes.
Both approaches are very different, but they're very valuable in different
Yes.
situations, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
You got
it's a great partnership. I love it.
you got good cop, bad cop going right on a.
Very, very good cop, bad cop. Yeah, for sure.
Love that. And has there been, with this, when you are investigating these or uncovering these, do you do the same thing? And if you find something, pass things off to law enforcement if something's uncovered?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, in the case of Michelle O'Connell and Eli Washtok, which was the first season of Criminal Conduct, we were able to complete forensic evidence study, like a blood spatter study that was not completed
Yeah.
because the person who commissioned that Eli Washtalk was
Right.
murdered. Right. And so we were able to talk to that blood spatter expert and get her to complete her analysis. And then we turned that over to law enforcement, hoping that they would reopen the case. Unfortunately, they didn't, because it's a sheriff's department down in St. Augustine that it was the person accused is one of their own, and they have very little motivation to really look at all the evidence, unfortunately.
I think on the other side of that, of what you do with pretend, that's a little bit more of a flip. It's not as much psychological, but it's more of actual these different side of crime that you're
Yeah.
looking at, which
Yeah,
is
criminal conduct. I know I said I'm not a big fan of true crime and stuff like that, but criminal conduct is more traditional true crime.
nice.
And that was by design, because that's what's really hot. And so we want it. And that's what John really likes. He's really hardcore true crime fan. In fact, when we go visit cities together,
Yeah.
we go to crime scenes because that's what he likes to do. Yeah.
I'm sure once again, yin and yang over here.
Our last trip to Dallas, we retraced Lee R. Harvey Oswald's escape route.
Oh.
It was really cool, actually. I thought it was going to be weird, but actually it was very interesting.
Is there been one of these cases that you've done in the past for 3 or 4 seasons that you've been like, this is nuts? Like to actually get into it with John, like this is just a little crazy that this actually happened and we didn't really
Yeah.
know as much.
Well, with criminal conduct, one of the things that we like to do is we like to pick cases that are a little left unresolved, so that it gives us some room to
Yeah.
move the needle. And we covered this case in season 2 about these constables in Kentucky. Constables are basically like they're they're elected officers of the law. They're kind of like little independent sheriffs.
Okay.
And so the only way to get rid of them, you have to wait for the next election cycle. And so these guys are incentivized to seize people's properties, people that they arrest, and that's how they make money. So like if they seize your car, your house, your
Right.
boat, your motorcycle, or your RV, they get a cut of that. So it created this incentive for them to like plant evidence and do all this stuff. And so when we started working on that season, we didn't really know how it was going to end.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden there was a shootout with the FBI. One of the constables died. I mean, it was just not during the shootout, but like afterwards. I mean, it was just like we never saw that coming at all, like when we started it, for sure.
You're like looking around going, what is going on?
Yeah, and it's all happening like in real time
Yeah.
too. So
Yeah.
we like going into a story a little bit not knowing how it's going to end.
I like that. An unfinished chapter.
Yep.
Nice. Coming away from the two that you have created, that you are part of and have had a hand in creating, in just in general podcasting, you've been in it for 6 years now. Where have you? I mean, everybody has a podcast now. Clearly, everybody
Sure.
everybody has something to talk about.
Right,
Where
right.
have you just seen the massive growth? You were saying, this isn't your full time job podcasting, but people do. Where do you see the growth in it?
I don't know. I feel like I'm very surprised, just like everyone else, that everyone does have a podcast. And part of me loves that because it gives such a democratized medium where anybody, literally with a phone, could pick up and start a podcast and have great conversations, kind of like what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's so many podcasts, and for the vast majority of people, I think it's just a hobby. It's not even a money making
Yeah.
thing. But then there's big networks starting up, like NBC, New York Times has podcast networks, Wall Street Journal. And so like you have these big players, these celebrities. I feel like it's going to start moving in that direction. I don't know. I think it's kind of interesting. I've only been doing this for 5 years. I've seen such transformational change
Yeah,
in the 5 years that I've been doing this. I really have a hard time envisioning where it's going, really, because it's still like the wild, wild west of podcasting.
it is. And I think to your point, I think now what we're seeing is a lot of people are becoming, they're not independent, that people are coming, they're into companies like Spotify, or like
Hmm.
you were saying, like big companies like Good Morning America now has three or however many so podcasts underneath them. And even, I mean, Barstool Sports, that's what they have, that whole branch of podcasts underneath them. I think you're seeing less of people being independent as their own podcast and standing alone and doing their own thing, and more of becoming part of a corporation or a big.
It's definitely really hard to be an independent podcaster and stand out nowadays because you're fighting against big giant corporations with huge budgets,
Yeah. I think Jason says it all the time. He said, if he's like, you're not famous, he said, your podcast is not going to blow up overnight.
Yep.
How do you stick out? And I've always carried that forward. Like, what is the thing that makes you different from everybody who does have that big budget or big brand names behind them?
You know what I think the big secret is, if you're like an independent podcaster that you want to make it in this field, is stick around.
Yeah.
I really do think the turtle wins the race in this.
Yes.
A lot of companies lose steam, like maybe the podcast is not as profitable as they want, so they cut it. And we've seen that with Spotify slashing shows. Um, I think that if you are serious, and want to make it a career or business, invest money into it, like your own personal money, like put like a couple $1,000s into advertisement and watch your show grow,
Yeah.
because if you can make your show grow if you pump
Yes.
money into it, like
Yeah.
with some capital. So,
Yes.
but it went from being like a really cheap hobby to a very expensive hobby,
It did. It did
yeah.
very quickly. It did, and I especially think over COVID, everybody started, and like you said, you can use your phone to record. I think everybody took that and
Right.
kind of ran with it pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You are probably, every time that I meet you and you are introduced, you are very humble about the things that how many views you get, how many things you've gotten to do with Pretend. You have had incredible growth with Pretend. Coming on now on the flip side of that other conversation, of the other question, like, can you just share the growth and kind of the feelings you see, like when you see that growth happening for Pretend?
Yeah, it's really cool. There's this website called Listen Notes, and you could plug in your podcast, and if it's big enough, it shows you how big it is in comparison to worldwide podcasts out there, because there's a lot of podcasts. And if I plug in Pretend, I think it's 0.1%. I don't know. I don't want to lie to you. Let me see. I don't I remember. I don't want to say the wrong thing, but if I plug in Pretend, let's see. It says that it's the 0.1% of all podcasts. So that's pretty cool. And they say that according to this, there's 3 million podcasts globally. And out of those 3 million, I'm not in the 1%. I'm in the 0.1%, which is really cool. But you wouldn't know that by how much I'm making, because obviously I can't afford to do this full time. But that just tells you, I think that just is symbolic of how many podcasts there are out there,
Yeah.
And even though my show, I would say, is mildly successful, I know shows that are way more successful and people that are doing it full time, that hire staff and all that. I'm still like chugging along solo. Every now and then I hire an editor.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's a lot of work. I feel like I'm burning on both ends.
I agree. I'm a one woman show, and I have been for as long as I've been doing podcasting, YouTubing for the last 5 years, and I've always been the editor. And people are like, "Well, don't you have people to help?" I'm like, "I can't. That money doesn't go that way sometimes.
Right.
It's more on the actual advertising, on the actual getting your name out there than you do
Hmm.
having somebody come in to help you edit or
Right.
whatever it may be."
Yep. I mean, it's a luxury to have somebody edit your show.
My last question for you, Javier, I love to end it with this question, is just what inspires you?
I think what inspires me, what inspired me to start the podcast to begin with was other podcasts that
Okay.
I really enjoyed. And I was like, wow, these are great storytellers. And that was like This American Life,
Yeah.
Radio Lab, Criminal, like those were the podcasts that got me started. And now what inspires me is really, I mean, it always is. I tell people all the time, it's really telling stories. It doesn't need to be true crime. I fantasize about doing a podcast almost like Seinfeld about nothing, like a show where I could just meet somebody
Yeah.
and ask them to tell me their life story. Like I don't care as long as I'm telling a story. So the people that I interview inspire me to keep going, and the listeners for sure.
Yeah.
Just the fact that like this is my hobby and
Yeah.
people are like writing me all the time. I can't even keep up with the emails, like I used to be able to respond to that. And
But
I mean, I try, but
yeah.
just the fact that people enjoy
Yeah.
what I'm putting out there for
Yeah.
fun,
Yeah.
I think that's so flattering. Yeah.
I think I was telling you beforehand, that's why I did this. I love the storytelling aspect of people getting to share their stories, because not one person got to where they are the same way as somebody else who's doing the exact same thing. And I love the storytelling aspect behind it,
Yeah.
because it's just a great outlet for everybody to
Yeah.
have. And so it's not surprising that everybody has a podcast, but it is cool that everybody has a separate story to tell.
I think everyone has a story to tell. I think some people are better storytellers than others, but
Yes.
I think that a good interviewer could get a story out of almost anybody,
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
how do you live your life and not have a story to tell, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Whether you think you have one to tell that's
Right.
actually important or not, I think is what is the battle that goes on in everybody's mind. But I agree with you. I think everybody has
Right.
a story to tell.
And not every story needs to be like this gigantic story either. I like the small, intimate stories too.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
actually like those a little bit more,
Yeah. Javier, I can't thank you enough for coming on and speaking with me today. And if you have not listened to Pretend or Criminal Conduct at all, they will be linked down below so you guys can go listen. And I'm excited to see what the next couple seasons hold for both these podcasts.
Well, thank you so much, Danielle. This was awesome.
Yeah.
Appreciate the time.
Thank you. Thank you. And as always, I will see you guys back here next time. Bye, y'all.